This is the HITSCAN Hyperlight, a lightweight polycarbonate mouse from a brand new name in the peripheral space, aiming to make a name for themselves in a rather saturated mouse market. In 2024, we've seen many new brands enter the scene with fantastic first releases, the most notable being Scientali with the S10, but HITSCAN, despite being a rather new brand, has done a lot right here with the Hyperlight. However, due to its polycarbonate nature, it does sadly repeat many of the same mistakes we've seen on other polycarbonate mice I've already covered this year. But we're going to talk all about those flaws as well as all the things HITSCAN has done right here on the Hyperlight in today's episode of the mel0n review. But before we get into it, a big thank you to HITSCAN for sending over the Hyperlight for review. I greatly appreciate it. As a reminder, as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. I will also have a full teardown for the Hyperlight releasing in a couple days after this review goes live. So if you enjoy the review and want to see how to mod and repair the Hyperlight, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. Alrighty, well without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. First, let's talk about in-game performance. Overall, the Hyperlight is a solidly performing mouse. Due to its polycarbonate shell and the mouse's design, the mouse is quite light, advertised as weighing in around 39 plus minus 1 gram, similar in weight to the Sora V2 and other polycarbonate mice I've previously covered. The shape is a decently executed symmetrical shape, but it's far too small for my 1905 by 12.7 hands, so I had to use a fingertip grip over my testing here, which isn't my preferred grip style. But despite this, the mouse still performed great across the board. For not so giant hands like mine, the mouse will be well suited for most hand sizes and most grip styles. The mouse's main clicks are also very well implemented, being mel0n switches, the same that we saw in the Sora V2, and they have a great snappy tactile feel to them. The rest of the buttons are also very well implemented, even though there's a unique switch choice here for the side clicks, which I'll talk more about later in this video. The mouse's coating is also fantastic, being very similar to the coating we saw in the Scientali S10, having that more chalky feeling, but it's still very grippy for both wet and dry hands and performed exceptionally well over my testing. The Hyperlight is also sporting the bread and butter combo of the Pixart 3395 and Nordic 52840 MCU, and as we've seen countless times with this combo, the implementation is fantastic and I didn't run into any connectivity or latency issues over my testing. On the topic of sensor, the Hyperlight is unique as it has a slightly forward sensor position, which is something we don't see too often. This unique sensor positioning has some interesting effects onto how the Hyperlight performs, as well as how you'll need to grip this mouse, but I'll talk more in depth about this unique sensor positioning later in this video. Now, by default, the Hyperlight only supports 1K polling over both wired and wireless connectivity modes, but you can purchase a separate 8K polling dongle to unlock 8K wireless polling, and both the stock 1K polling rates and the 2, 4, and 8K polling rates are very well implemented and perform as you'd expect. Surprisingly, the Hyperlight doesn't come with many accessories, but it does include both full-size and half-size stock skates, both of which are actually the best stock skates I've seen included with a mouse this year, and I'll talk about why that is in a moment. My only real complaint here with the Hyperlight is that the stock cable is extremely thick and rigid, so much so that it makes the wired usage here in the Hyperlight borderline unusable, but I'll talk more about the stock cable and the wired experience as well as the other aspects of this mouse more in depth in this video. In terms of unboxing, the Hyperlight comes in a smaller box with very minimalistic branding across it. The box is semi-easy to open, but you might have to shake it a few times to slide the base out enough for you to grab it and pull the lid off. I would love to see HITSCAN add pull tabs or adjust the Hyperlight's box so the base and the lid are less snug in future batches, so it'd be easier to actually open the box. Inside we have the Hyperlight itself. HITSCAN sent over the white colorway, but it is also available in a full black colorway. Interestingly, the mouse doesn't come with any skates pre-installed, which is a great attention to detail, and I'm actually very happy to see this. Under the mouse we have the included 1K polling dongle. It's shaped more like a puck rather than the more boxy dongles we've seen included with other mice, but despite its shape, it does have a full silicone base and it does anchor itself surprisingly well to desktops. We also have the aforementioned thick rigid USB-C cable. It is a standard USB-A to C cable, but the USB-C end isn't tilted, which is very disappointing to see. We also have the two sets of stock skates I mentioned earlier, a full-size control set and a half-size speed set, and since the mouse doesn't come with any skates pre-installed out of the box, you can install your preferred set of these stock skates or aftermarkets right out of the box, which is a great attention to detail. Lastly, we have this little welcome card from HITSCAN and a full paper user manual, which is wonderful to see included. HITSCAN was also kind enough to send over the Hyperlight's 8K polling dongle as well, so let's quickly talk about that. The 8K polling dongle comes in a tiny little box with the same minimalist branding as the Hyperlight's box. Inside we have the 8K polling dongle itself, which is the same shape and design as the included 1K polling dongle. The only difference aside from their supported report rates is that the 8K polling dongle has an LED indicator under the HITSCAN logo on the top of the dongle. There is also a pairing guide included here which tells you how to connect the 8K dongle and disable its LED, which is a nice attention to detail. When I initially opened the 8K dongle, I didn't think it came with any guides, but later on I found that the guide was actually stuck to the top of the lid, so if you don't see a quick start guide included with your 8K dongle, check the top of the box. Overall, the Hyperlight and its 8K pulling dongles unboxing experience is good, a little hard to open, but nonetheless pretty decent. However, I am very surprised that the HITSCAN didn't include any grip tape or dust stickers. On most, if not all mice with an open base design, the mouse usually includes dust stickers to prevent dust and debris from getting inside the mouse. We've seen this on Lamzu and G-Wolves, which have included dust stickers with their mice, and I'm very surprised not to see them here on the Hyperlight given its open base design. In terms of build quality and QC, since the Hyperlight shell is polycarbonate, it will feel slightly different from the more traditional ABS plastic shells you'll find on other mice. Out of the box, the Hyperlight feels quite solid with no creaking or flexing anywhere on the top or bottom shells, and over my testing, my unit didn't develop any issue areas. Now, because the shell is polycarbonate, if you do death grip the mouse, you will feel a little flex in the top shell, but this is common for all polycarbonate shells, and it's nothing that will actually affect the usage experience here on the Hyperlight. In terms of QC, the mouse is very well built, all the mouse buttons feel consistent, the base doesn't have any warping issues and sits completely flat out of the box, and the mouse's internal construction and soldering are quite good as well. Over my testing time with the Hyperlight, I didn't run into any physical, mechanical, or technical issues, which is impressive considering this is HITSCAN's first ever mouse. As I mentioned earlier, the Hyperlight's polycarbonate shell and design make this mouse much lighter than most ABS plastic mice you'll see on the market, but just like we saw with Wise Owl's recent releases, there is a sizable difference between the mouse's advertised weight and its true weight. According to the Hyperlight spec sheet, HITSCAN lists this mouse as weighing in around 39 plus minus 1 gram. Weighing in my unit in its stock configuration with no skates installed, it weighs in at exactly 40 grams. This is technically within the 39 plus minus 1 gram weight spec, but by the slightest margins possible. However, just like we saw in the Wise Owl OGM Pro V2 and Cloud V2's advertised weight specs, the Hyperlight's weight spec does not include the weight of the stock skates. Weighing in the included skates, the full-size stock skates weigh approximately 2 grams, and the half-size speed skates weigh in approximately 1.1 grams. I did remove 0.1 grams from each skate weight to account for the paperweight here. Adding those values to my Hyperlight's true weight, the mouse's true weight range will be either 41.1 grams with the speed skates or 42 grams with the full-size stock skates, which is well above the advertised 39 plus minus 1 gram weight spec. So regardless of what skates you use here on the Hyperlight, whether it's one of the included stock skates or a set of aftermarket skates, the mouse will weigh in at least 1 to 2 grams over the advertised weight spec, which is very disappointing to see. Now, I have a feeling I know why HITSCAN is advertising the Hyperlight's weight like this. Since Nujutsu is advertising the Sora V2 stock weight as 39.5 plus minus 2 grams, HITSCAN wanted to match or beat the advertised weight spec of the Sora V2 so it'd be more of a direct competitor. But in doing so, they've made the same mistakes as, unlike the Sora V2, which weighed in at 41.1 grams with the full-size stock skates installed, and of course was well within the advertised weight spec, the Hyperlight's true weight spec is well outside the mouse's advertised weight spec. Now, I'm well aware I'm splitting hairs here, and realistically a 0.5 to 1 gram difference isn't going to affect the user experience, but I'd still like to see HITSCAN update their marketing for the Hyperlight to better reflect the true weight of the product here. If the mouse was advertised as weighing in 40 with a plus minus 2 gram ratio of 2 grams, that would much better reflect the true weight of the mouse and better account for the weight added by the stock skates or aftermarket skates. Another area where the Hyperlight is a little odd is in terms of its balancing. Generally speaking, most mice are balanced to match the location of the sensor, which is usually at the midline of the mouse, so most mice end up being centrally balanced. However, the Hyperlight, as I mentioned earlier, has a forward sensor position, so you would expect this mouse to be forward balanced, but for some reason it isn't, as it's still centrally balanced despite its forward sensor position. I assume HITSCAN centrally balanced the mouse to try and railroad users into gripping the mouse a specific way so they can utilize this forward sensor positioning, but in reality, this just makes the mouse feel kind of weird, as people will grip the mouse in a way that makes the sensor feel normal, which results in the mouse feeling a little back heavy. Over my testing time with the Hyperlight, I found myself gripping the mouse much further up in the shell than I normally do on mice like the Sora V2, for example, as I naturally wanted to match the sensor's location. Because of this, the Hyperlight did feel back heavy, specifically with fingertip grips. On palm and claw grips, this won't be as much of an issue, so to speak, but I keep this in mind is that if you're considering getting the Hyperlight and use a fingertip grip, the mouse will feel a little weird in your hand due to the unique balancing. Next, let's talk about shape. The Hyperlight is a fairly standard symmetrical shape. While it's optimized for right hand use, you can use it with your left hand, but you won't have access to side buttons. So while it is technically ambidextrous, it is optimized for right hand use. In terms of dimensions, the mouse measures 118 by 61 by 38 millimeters, almost the exact same dimensions as a Sora V2, interestingly enough, which measured at 119 by 60 by 38 millimeters. In terms of the mouse's shape characteristics, looking at the Hyperlight from the top, we can see its standard symmetrical shape with its very slight hourglass-like curvature. Flipping the mouse over, we can better see the slight hourglass curvature of the shell, and when compared to the base of the Sora V2, you can better see that slightly forward sensor position I talked about earlier. Looking at the mouse from the sides, we can better see the mouse's hump profile, which terminates ever so slightly behind the midline of the mouse. We can also see that the hump's curvature is much more aggressive towards the front of the mouse than it is the rear. Looking at the front, because of the more aggressive forward tilt we saw in the Hyperlight's upper shell, the Hyperlight's main clicks sit much lower in the shell than we've seen on other similarly sized mice. You can also see that the mouse's sides are angled slightly outward at approximately an 87-degree angle. And lastly, looking from the rear of the mouse, we can see the mouse's hump shape, which is a standard wider rounded hump, similar in shape to the Sora V2's hump, just not as tall as rounded towards the peak. Now, the reason why I'm using the Sora V2 as a comparison point here is that the mice feel very similar in the hand, as they're almost the same shape, size, have similar weight specs, and have the same shell materials. The only thing that sets a Hyperlight apart from the Sora V2 is the shell curvature, the slightly forward sensor position, and the centralized hump. Aside from that, the two mice are very similar, hence why I'm using it as a comparison point here. In terms of contact areas and grip compatibility, HITSCAN is advertising that the Hyperlight is optimized for claw grips while being usable for all other grip types such as palm grip and fingertip grips. For my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands, this mouse was far too small for use a claw or palm grip on, so I was forced to use a fingertip grip while testing this mouse. Now, due to the more centralized hump positioning, the Hyperlight when used with claw and palm grips makes most of its contact with the mid-palm region of your hand, lesser so on thenar and hypothenar. If you use an angled grip, there will be more emphasis on thenar and hypothenar contact, but the primary contact point will still be the mid-palm region of your hand, but of course this will vary depending on your hand size. Now, while HITSCAN says that the Hyperlight is optimized for claw grips, I'd argue that the mouse is optimized for all grip styles, as the mouse is usable for all grip styles with most hand sizes. As such, from my testing, I'd estimate that for small hands, the mouse would be great for palm grips. For small to medium hands, it'll be great for palm and claw grips. For medium hands, it'll be good for palm, claw, and fingertip grip. For medium to large hands, it'll be great for claw and fingertip grips. And for large hands like mine, it'll be great for fingertip grips. Just keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, that when you fingertip grip the Hyperlight, you will most likely grip a little more forward in the shell than you would on a mouse with a centralized sensor position due to the Hyperlight's slightly forward sensor. In terms of the Hyperlight's coating, since it's a polycarbonate shell, the coating here is very similar to the coatings we've seen on other polycarbonate mice. The closest analog to the coating here would be the coating on the Centali S10, as the Hyperlight's coating shares the same very chalky yet grippy feeling. It's also similar to the coatings we saw on the Sprime PM1 and the Sora V2, just chalkier and a little grippier in my opinion. For both wet and dry hands, the coating performs very well, but the coating is best suited for sweatier hands, as the coating is the grippiest when it's exposed to a little bit of moisture. As someone with very sweaty hands, I was able to keep a consistent fingertip grip on the Hyperlight shell throughout my testing. If you use a palm or claw grip, the anchoring will be even better, as you'll make even more contact with the shell's grippy surface. However, just like all great coatings, the Hyperlight's coating does attract fingerprints, oils, dust, etc. like a magnet does metal, similar to what happened with the coatings we found in the OGM Pro V2 and the OP1AK. Because of this, if you have the black colorway of the Hyperlight, the mouse will most likely have that grimy look to it unless you wipe the mouse off with a cleaning cloth frequently. On the white colorway of the Hyperlight, the shell doesn't show dust, oils, and fingerprints nearly as much, so if you're picky about the appearance of your mouse, I'd recommend getting the white colorway over the black colorway. Now, before I move on, I wanted to mention again that the Hyperlight, unlike most of the mice we've seen released this year, doesn't come with any grip tape. So if you dislike the feeling of the mouse's chalky coating, you will have to purchase grip tape separately. If you're going to purchase grips here for the Hyperlight, I'd recommend getting the X-Ray Cicada Wing 2.0s or Geckos 2.0, as they're the best aftermarket grips I've personally tested. Now, in regards to the Hyperlight's main clicks, as I mentioned earlier, the main clicks feel fantastic, but HITSCAN has made some rather interesting claims about them. them. According to HITSCAN, the Hyperlight's main clicks feature optimized click tensioning for minimal pre-travel, which is an interesting claim, but we'll dive into that a little more in a moment. But first, let's talk about the shell buttons themselves. The shell buttons are averagely sized with a very pronounced curvature to them to match the more aggressive forward tilt of the shell's curvature. They're similar in shape to the Sora V2's main clicks, just much more aggressively curved. The shell clicks also have these heavy concave grooves in them that run up to about the midpoint of the shell click. The indentations here are very similar to the indentations we saw on the Razer Viper V3 Pro shell buttons, and these deep indentations naturally guide your fingers to the middle of the shell clicks, but if you click towards the top of the shell clicks, there won't be any indentation there, so keep that in mind. The shell buttons also share the same coating as the rest of the Hyperlight shell, so the shell buttons are very grippy, and combined with the heavy indentation in the shell clicks themselves, it's very easy to keep your fingers anchored on the Hyperlight shell button. In terms of click audio, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. As you can probably tell from the click audio here, the Hyperlight is using mel0n's 70 million click lifespan switches here for the main clicks, which I'm very happy to see as the mel0n switches have become my personal favorite this year. In terms of actuation weight, the Hyperlight's main clicks feel average, being around a 4 out of 10 in actuation force, very similar to the actuation weight we saw in the Sora V2 and the S10's main clicks. Now in regards to the advertised optimized click tensioning for minimal pre-travel here, on my unit the pre-travel isn't exactly minimal, as there is a lot of movement before the click actually actuates. I'd still classify it as a lower amount of overall pre-travel when compared to mice like the OGM Pro V2 and the OP1AK, but mice like the Centauri S10, Sprime PM1, and Sora V2 have slightly less overall pre-travel than the Hyperlight does. So while technically speaking, HITSCAN is correct in saying that the Hyperlight has minimal pre-travel, but it's not going to be anything revolutionary, as in reality the pre-travel here is very similar to many mice we've already covered here on the channel. In terms of post-travel, just like you saw in the S10, there is a high degree of post-travel on the main clicks, depending on how heavy your click weight is. Since I have a very heavy click, there was a large amount of post-travel from my experience, but if you have a lighter click weight, the post-travel will feel more around a medium range. But despite the variability in the post-travel, the Hyperlight's main clicks have a great snappy rebound to them, so despite the medium to long range of post-travel, they still feel very snappy and very spammable. Both the Hyperlight's main clicks also feel consistent in terms of their pre and post-travel, however, depending on where you click on the shell, the actuation weight will slightly change. It'll be the lowest towards the end of the shell buttons, but it'll gradually get stronger the closer you get to the top of the shell. At the very top, I'd say the increase in actuation weight is only about 15%, not super significant, but enough where I thought it was worth mentioning. Another great attention to detail here is that both the shell clicks are very well stabilized and very well anchored, and don't have any significant play to either button. The main clicks are also indented into the shell, albeit very slightly, but enough so where the clicks are free from any interference issues that could be caused by your thumb, pinky, or ring finger resting against the sides of the shell. For the side buttons, the shell buttons have a very prominent roundness to them. HITSCAN is actually advertising that the Hyperlight side buttons are more pronounced for effortless actuation, so this more pronounced roundness is to be expected here. But just like the main clicks where HITSCAN was advertising that the main clicks have a minimal pre-travel, the advertised more pronounced nature of the side buttons isn't as impactful as advertised. While the side buttons are more pronounced from the shell than ones we've seen on the Sora V2, it's not by a large enough margin where they're unique, as they're pretty much one for one with the side buttons we saw on the Centauri S10. So while they are more pronounced than some mice's side buttons, again, it's not anything revolutionary here on the Hyperlight. In terms of the side buttons coating, sadly the side buttons aren't using the same coating as the rest of the Hyperlight shell. Instead, they appear to be a raw plastic. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing per se, as the more pronounced roundness of the side buttons does make the side buttons very easy to actuate. However, if your fingers are very sweaty, you might run into some gripability issues here. Personally, I didn't have any issues over my testing, but your experience may vary from mine. In terms of click audio, I'll give you a quick little sound test for the side buttons here. And as I mentioned earlier, interestingly enough, just like we saw in the YSL OGM Pro V2, we have a rather unique switch choice here for the side buttons, as it's using a TTC brown shell blue dot switch with a 3 million click lifespan. Another brand new switch type that I've never seen on a mouse before. In terms of the actuation weight, the side buttons feel very similar to the actuation weight of the main clicks, feeling around a 4.5 out of 10, but unlike the main clicks, the side clicks have essentially zero pre-travel and a slight bit of post-travel. The side buttons also have a fantastic rebound just like the min clicks, so they're still very snappy and very spammable. The actuation weight and pre and post travel is consistent here on both the side buttons, and both side buttons are very well anchored and stabilized, so there's little to no play on either side button. I'm actually quite impressed with the side buttons here. Normally when brands try to experiment with different switch types like the ones we saw in the OGM Pro V2, the side buttons often feel out of place from the rest of the unit. However, the TTC switches here on the Hyperlight are fantastic, and they feel very similar to the 1.0 black shell white dot switches we commonly see used for side buttons here, so while it is a bit of a unique switch choice, the implementation here on the Hyperlight is quite good. And the last button we have yet to cover is the scroll wheel, so let's talk about that next. The scroll wheel here on the Hyperlight is very similar to the scroll wheels we saw in the Sprime PM1 and Sora V2, being a plastic wheel with a thin rubber texture wrapped around it. The scroll wheel here is easy to grip and scroll, and the flattened rubber texture makes clicking the scroll wheel very easy. Inside the Hyperlight is using a TTC Gold encoder. This encoder gives the scroll wheel a smooth scroll with a scroll force of around 4.5 with very slightly pronounced scroll points. However, as we usually see on lighter scroll wheels with less pronounced scroll points, scroll wheel clicking is rather inconsistent here on the Hyperlight, as due to the scroll wheel's looser feeling, whenever you go to scroll wheel click, it's very easy to accidentally scroll the wheel up or down, which is quite disappointing to see here on the Hyperlight. Speaking of the scroll wheel click, inside the Hyperlight is using the same Kale pillar switch with a 3 million click lifespan that we saw in the Sprime PM1 and the Sora V2. This button does give the scroll wheel click a higher actuation weight, feeling more around a 6 out of 10, but due to it being a pillar switch, the rebound is very slow and very mushy, so the scroll wheel lacks that snappy rebound you'll find on mice using non-pillar scroll wheel switches. And as I mentioned at the top of this video, the Hyperlight is using the bread and butter Pixar 3395 and Nordic 52840 MCU combo. We've seen this combo countless times over this year, with the Sprime PM1, Sora V2, Centauri S10 also using this combo. And over my testing, the sensor and MCU performed perfectly and I had no connectivity or latency issues, as I expected, just like we've seen on all the other mice using this bread and butter combo. The sensor itself has the expected DPI range of 50 to 26,000 and does have motion sync, ripple, and angle snapping enabled on the sensor, and these can be enabled or disabled via the Hyperlight software. The sensor also has the standard 1mm and 2mm LOD levels, and just like we saw in the Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1, the mouse does also have a high performance mode which you can enable to get a little more performance out of the sensor. However, it is only usable on 1K Hz, so while it won't be as impactful as 2 and 4K polling rates, it's nice to see this option available here for people who opt not to purchase the 8K polling dongle, so you can get a little more performance out of the Hyperlight at the cost of some slightly reduced battery life. Admittedly, I am really surprised not to see a Pixar 3950 here, seeing as most if not every mouse that's released recently is using this sensor. I assume that HITSCAN wanted to use the 3950 here on the Hyperlight but just couldn't secure stock from Pixar due to demand, so they were forced to use the 3395. Now, to be clear, this is totally fine, but you will be missing out on some improvements and some features you'd find on the 3950, such as the 30,000 DPI range and the 0.7 LOD, the sensor tilt option, as well as some small performance improvements across the board. To be clear, the realistic difference between the two sensors is very slight and it's not anything you're going to notice day to day. However, it's still surprising that we're not seeing the 3950 here due to the mouse's release time. Another unique aspect of the sensor is the positioning, which is slightly forward above the midline of the mouse by around 2mm or so. Now, this forward sensor will make the mouse feel faster to an extent, but there are some unique variables caused by the sensor positioning, as I mentioned earlier, so the way this mouse is going to feel in your hand and the way you're going to grip this mouse is going to be a little different from what you'd find on a mouse with a centralized sensor position like the Sora V2, for example. In terms of high polling rate implementations here on the Hyperlight, by default, the mouse only supports 1K polling on both wired and wireless connectivity modes, and as expected, the 1K polling is well implemented and performs completely fine. The higher polling rates are also very well implemented. Of course, you do need to purchase a separate 8K dongle to use them, as I mentioned earlier, but the 2 and 4K polling rates perform very well over my testing and are on par with the other 2 and 4K polling rates we've seen on other mice. I wasn't able to test the 8K polling due to the age of my system, but the other polling rates, as I mentioned, are very well implemented from my testing. I do hope we'll see support for wired 4 or 8K polling on HITSCAN's next mouse, as well as an 8K polling dongle included by default, as most if not all high performance mice nowadays include this by default. Speaking of high polling rates, let's talk about the Hyperlight's battery next. Inside, the mouse is using a 250 mAh battery, the same battery size as the one we saw inside the Sora V2 and Sprime PM1. HITSCAN is advertising that the Hyperlight's 250 mAh battery will have up to 75 hours of battery life, but again, they don't list what report rate this was measured on or the testing environment. Now, from my testing, testing, on 1K polling the mouse lasted approximately 52 hours, and this is with the high performance mode on 2K polling it was around 33 hours, 4K polling 28 hours, and on 8K polling it was 14 hours. Now keep in mind that the estimates I gave are just measured off of constant motion, not general use, so while my values are lower here than you'd expect or what's advertised, the data here is representative of how long the Hyperlight will last in game or in high use scenarios. For general use, the mouse's battery life will be much longer. So in regards to the advertised 75-hour battery life here, the Hyperlight will easily surpass this on both the low and high power modes on 1K polling, and of course on other polling rates it will have different levels as I just mentioned. In terms of charging time, the mouse charged from 0% to full in approximately 2 hours, charging off a USB-A port on my PC via the included stock cable. Now as I mentioned earlier in this video, the Hyperlight comes with some of the best stock skates I've seen included with a mouse this year. The stock skates are 100% PTFE skates with a larger rounded edge to them. The PTFE isn't as hard as a traditional stock skate would be, but it's also not as soft as those dual layered stock skates we saw come with the OGM Pro V2. They kind of feel like a hybrid of both, if that makes sense. So this means that the stock skates here are going to be a little slower than the more traditional stock skates, but they're going to be faster than the softer 100% PTFE stock skates, kind of being a hybrid skate in terms of their performance. Now, while I actually do like the feeling of the stock skates here, they are still unbalanced in terms of their surface area, which is unfortunate to see, as they're easily the most usable stock skates I've personally tested this year. So while the skates are quite good, due to their unbalanced surface area, I didn't use them as I just hate unbalanced skates. Instead, I opted to use aftermarket skates like the Unusual Way Esports Silver Fox skates and the Ghost Glide Vortex skates, as they perform much better from my testing. But for most people, the Hyperlight stock skates will be totally fine. But that said, I still would like to see a balanced set of skates included with a future version of the Hyperlight. Hopefully HITSCAN can include a set of dot skates of the same skate material as the stocks we see here, as those would be really great skates, but also of course they would have a balanced surface area. So hopefully we'll see dot skates included on HITSCAN's next release. Now the Hyperlight stock cable, as I mentioned earlier, is very thick and very rigid with a non-tilted USB-C end, which makes the wired experience here on the Hyperlight less than ideal. Funnily enough, we've actually seen this thick, rigid, non-tilted USB-C cable before, as the Hyperlight stock cable is the exact same cable we saw included with the Centauri S10. So the Hyperlight stock cable shares the same insane thickness, rigidity of the S10 stock cable. This thickness makes the cable incompatible with mouse bungees, and the rigidity makes the stock cable very heavy and very awkward to use. And of course, the USB-C end isn't tilted, so the cable will drag against your mousepad surface, but thankfully the cable has a very low friction paracord wrapping around it, so the tilting isn't the biggest issue, but the cable overall is still less than ideal to use. Now, since the mouse only supports 1K polling on wired connectivity, the cable being unusable for wired use isn't the biggest issue, but it still doesn't excuse the less than ideal stock cable here, as you see mice like the Pulsar X2 series, which also only supported 1K polling over wired and wireless, include significantly better cables than what we see here on the Hyperlight. Hopefully on future mice from HITSCAN, ones that will most likely support 4 and 8K polling rates via the wired connection, we'll see a better included stock cable, hopefully one similar to the stock cables we saw in the X2 series. On the topic of the cable, I do have another issue with the cable, or more accurately the USB-C port here on the Hyperlight, as it is a non-universal size. At this point, I'm not surprised to see this, as seeing as every single polycarbonate mouse I've covered this year has the exact same non-universal USB-C port, but I'm still very disappointed to see it here, as it makes it impossible to use a better cable here with the Hyperlight, as cables like the stock cable from the Pulsar X2 series won't fit in the Hyperlight's USB-C port. You can use the stock cables that came with the Sora V2 and Sprime PM1, as they're more flexible, but even with those cables, the wired experience here on the Hyperlight is still less than ideal, definitely an area where HITSCAN can make some improvements for their next mouse. I also wanted to quickly talk about the Hyperlight software. Instead of jumping on the web-based software train like most brands have been doing, HITSCAN opted instead to design a local software here for the Hyperlight, but the software here, while not being web-based, is actually really good. The software is very lightweight and very easy to use. The layout is simple and it's very easy to navigate. The battery readout in the software, it does also have a numerical value, and from my testing it's actually quite accurate, which is great to see. Overall, the software is great. I have no complaints about it. Of course, it would be nice to see a web-based software in the future, but I'm very happy to see that HITSCAN shipped a local version for now and is going to take their time and hopefully develop a web-based based software for their future mice and not rush it like a lot of other brands have done. And lastly, let's talk about repairability. Now, sometimes polycarbonate mouse can be a little tricky to repair due to extra clips or other anchoring mechanisms that are used to keep the shell rigid, but here on the Hyperlight there aren't any major issues and the unit is very easy to service. To open the unit, all you need to do is remove 4 Phillips head screws from the base. Once those are removed, you can run your fingernail or a pry bar along the seam between the top and bottom shelves, and you can disconnect the shells very easily. Now, there is a ribbon cable that runs through the side button PCB from the base to the top shell. However, unlike other side button cables, the one here is very long and it's very easy to disconnect without straining the cable, which is fantastic to see. In terms of serviceable parts, the battery and the side buttons are very easy to service. The rest of the unit is soldered, so you can't swap encoders or the main switches without desoldering them, but this is pretty par for the course. But overall, the Hyperlight is a very serviceable mouse, much more so than the Sprime PM1 and Sora V2 were, which is great to see. And as always, for every mouse I cover here on the channel, I will have a full teardown for the Hyperlight coming out in a couple days after this review goes live. So if you want to see how to take apart the Hyperlight to see the individual parts, weights, and modding options, and etc., be sure to get subscribed. Alright, well, in closing, overall, for this being HITSCAN's first mouse, I am quite impressed. They've done a lot of things right, specifically with their click implementation, the shape design, coding and battery optimization, and the mouse's performance is great. Of course, the mouse is also very serviceable, and it does also include the best stock skates I've seen included with a mouse this year. But sadly, the HITSCAN does have a lot of flaws. The niche marketing for the side buttons and the main click should be removed, as HITSCAN isn't doing anything new per se here. The advertised weight spec is significantly off and should be updated to 40 plus minus 2 grams, as that would much better reflect the true weight of the mouse. The scroll wheel is too loose for my taste, as I'd much rather see an 11 or 13mm encoder here to prevent misactuating issues with the scroll wheel. The non-universal USB-C port is very disappointing and should be universal sized, and the lack of included grips and dust stickers is very surprising. And of course, the forward sensor positioning is a little overhyped here by HITSCAN, and the weight balancing that goes along with it just makes this mouse feel a little weird in the hands, specifically with fingertip grips. Now, to be completely fair, many of these critiques I'm making here are very minimal, and I'm very much splitting hairs in some areas, but just because HITSCAN is the new kid on the block, so to speak, I'm not going to review their product any differently from anyone else, and I'm going to make the same criticisms I've made here as I've made on other mice. But overall, despite its flaws, I'm still very impressed with what HITSCAN has done here with the Hyperlight. Releasing your first mouse with a non-standard sensor position is a ballsy move, and I gotta give them credit for that. And I'm sure on their next iteration of the Hyperlight, or whatever mouse they're going to release next, they'll address most, if not all, of my criticisms here. So I'm very excited to see what they release next, and I'll be keeping a very close eye on HITSCAN going forward. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much again to HITSCAN for sending over the Hyperlight for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thanks to our channel members, Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, Lunaris, Mark World, and everyone else. Thank you very much for your support as you make what I do here on the channel possible. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth product reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. This is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also help support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, TJ Exclusives, and Mech Keys, as well as a couple other retailers, to save yourself some money on your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the HITSCAN Hyperlight, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review.